Okay, thank you. Right, thank you very much for this invitation to speak to this complex topic. Thanks for the brochure for this really impressive program. In line with my previous speakers, I hope to be able to broaden some of these issues on the subject from a historical perspective. And I think one of the things I want to touch on is the emergence of reproductive rights in the context of medical ethics, and also the role of politics and geopolitics, and how these actually are interconnected. In a sense, I want to raise again awareness that we need to be quite context specific when we look at these matters, and that we have to be conscious how we read the history. It's not sometimes not that easy, actually. And so what I want to do is I make it, I'm sure we will have a conversation later on, but I want to make it concrete, and I want to give you an example of some of these difficult issues. And I want to go beyond the sort of usually Western perspective. I want to look at Eastern Europe. And I want to look at how and by whom some of these rights actually emerged and were negotiated. And I start with a bioethicist called Bela Blažová, and who in 2009, he painted quite a dystopic picture of the history of medicine under communism in Central Europe, i.e. before 1989. Open debate about patient autonomy and consent had apparently been absent and non-existent. While Marxist-Leninist philosophy and ethics had, quote, nothing to say about death and dying, abortion, euthanasia, HIV/AIDS, and suicide had apparently been classed as taboo subjects. His interests also extended to the realm of socialist individuals and society in which, quote, the body, the organs, and everything else had belonged to the community. Eastern European socialist and communist states were, in his analysis, quote, inherently paternalistic, and had left the region in a state of chaos and misery in the period after 1989. Now, this view may be understandable, but I will argue that this is too reductionist, and we need to actually complicate this picture slightly. And I want to give you some assessment of a case study where we looked at, or I looked at with colleagues at Poland. I think this narrative will reveal the extent to which Central Eastern European experts collaborated with the regimes of the day, indeed, without abandoning key ethical principles, and tried to find compromises. And I will be looking at one particular ethicist. His name is Tadeusz Kielanowski, who used the development of new codes of ethics to initiate more informed and less religiously motivated public discourses about contentious medical ethics issues, including issues relating to abortion. Now, but before I do, I just want to give you a bit of context. 1945, I'm sure you're quite aware of this, but how things were actually looking at that time. This is sort of the usual narrative. When we talk about medical ethics, we talk about Nuremberg, we talk about the Nuremberg Code. This is the sort of usual narrative, and we look at how that actually informed both the Declaration of Helsinki and future development of bioethics. Now, as I said, I want to complicate this picture a little bit. And I want to start here. This is how Warsaw looked after 1945. And I think it's sometimes not bad actually just to remind ourselves how destroyed actually that whole region was. So, and that many of the issues there were very, very relevant for those experts living there. When I recently gave a paper in Krakow, it was quite powerful actually to realize these were the actual professors of the University of Krakow who were killed in some of the camps in Warsaw. So for the Polish colleagues, these issues were very much alive, very much concrete at the time. Now, and I'm going to concentrate on this gentleman here. His name is Tadeusz Kielanowski, who very early on had considerable exchanges with UK colleagues and Western colleagues. And I want to give you a bit of background about him and his involvement in trying to establish some of these issues relating to abortion. Now, he was born in 1905 into a family of physicians in the city of Liviv. He had spent his high school years in Austria and later in France. He had read law and political sciences before studying medicine. So he grew up in the city of Liviv, as I mentioned, and it was a city in which the memory of Polish pogroms against the Jewish population after the First World War were very much alive at that time. Two of his fellow citizens were Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterpacht. Now, it is quite interesting, actually, when you look at actually where do these people who are actually pushing for these issues, where do they come from? In the same vein that Lemkin developed the concept of genocide during the Second World War as the crimes of all crimes, and Lauterpacht introduced the concept of crimes against humanity, which became part of the statutes in the Nuremberg trials, i.e. the murder of 4 million Jews and Poles on the territory of Poland. Kielanowski, from a very early on age, he was very much sensitized to the role of ethics and human rights on vulnerable population groups. So it's very interesting to see actually that broader context. And as I'm arguing, it was this pan-European, multilingual, interwar environment which shaped his secular outlook on the role of medicine in his native Poland and convinced him to take what I would call a pragmatic approach to the political agenda at the time, particularly in relationship to the ruling Communist Party in the 1950s. His trip to Britain in 1949 signaled the beginning of his wide-ranging involvement in political and social issues, and these included the formulation of a new ethics codes in the late 1950s, which addressed the contentious issues of abortion for social reasons. And I will come back to that in a moment. So what we see here in the 1950s, there is considerable debate, actually even public debate about these issues among theologians, philosophers, lawyers, and physicians who discuss these issues from their respective Catholic, Marxist, and secular vantage points. Now, one of the most contentious issues, as you can imagine, in a deeply Catholic country like Poland, was the issue of abortion. And the interesting issue here is how did experts and people who were trying to improve the situation, how did they navigate that environment? And so I want to give you an idea how Kielanowski actually tried to do this. He put forward not a finalized draft, he put a draft code, and he published that in a journal with some of his colleagues. What's interesting about this code in 1959 is that it was based on multiple documents. So he had read extremely widely, and just among some of the codes he had been looking at, as you can see, from the Warsaw Medical Society, but also Western codes like the WMA's International Code, the British Code from '53, the French Code, and Italian codes. So he had really tried to integrate many of these documents into a new code of ethics and find a consensus in society. However, he didn't mention abortion by name in that code. Surprise, surprise. He sidestepped the issue by omitting a paragraph on the subject. And when we're now looking actually at what he's formulated, you wouldn't even realize that it actually has anything to do with abortion if you read it. So this is what Article 34 says. All medical activities or treatments should be scientifically or socially justified. Wow, that's quite a lot. You know, you would think, but this is not very strong. A physician is not allowed to perform unjustified procedures solely at a patient request. This is very general. This is very doesn't specify anything. You wouldn't think this is anyone really who's doing much for women's reproductive rights in the first instance. Now that's what I'm trying to alert you to. We need to look at it a little bit more closer. The wording in that particular context allowed for sufficient flexibility to judge the abortion of an unhealthy or malformed child or one which would be born out of wedlock or into a socially and economically unstable family context as potentially justifiable and thus permissible. The discretion to decide for or against abortion, however, rested with the physician and not with the patient. The latter had no right to request it. Moreover, the abortion of a healthy child within a financially or socially stable family context was deemed a quote unjustified procedure and therefore not permissible, even if the patient requested it. Principle 34, according to Kielanowski, apparently was sufficient to provide physicians with sufficient guidance and about abortions. Now, we have to know that since 56, abortion had been legalized in particular circumstances. And I think what we are seeing here is Kielanowski wanted to use this legalization to broaden the possibilities here for physicians. Now, let me give you my interpretation of this now, and then we can see what we make of it. Now, what he and Polish ethicists regarded as what they called a moderate approach to the issue of abortion may initially, when viewed from our Western perspective, bioethical perspective, appear as a post-war re-establishment and reaffirmation of medical paternalism as the guiding paradigm of Polish medical ethics discourses. However, the draft code reflected his desire in this very, very politicized, very, very difficult context to find common ground and ideally a lasting compromise with societal groups who vehemently opposed the legislation of abortion for social reasons. In the years 57 and 58, according to his own account, he was involved in heated public exchanges with those who deemed themselves, and I quote, as the defenders of morality, unquote. Now, who exactly these groups were will require further work, and I'm very interested to find more about those kind of groups, but I think we have probably, they come from the religious community to some extent, certainly. Who, while supporting, quote, planned pregnancies, various defamatory articles in the press seem to have portrayed him as a proponent of the, quote, pro-abortion argument and had ignored his opposition against the, quote, death of women and girls as a result of procedures performed illegally by unqualified physicians. Now, this controversy about abortion in the mid-50s had reminded Kielanowski's and colleagues like himself about their attempt, the pre-war attempt, to establish a counseling center for conscious motherhood in the city of Liviv, with his physician colleague, Mikaelina Pawlukova. Now, one of his colleagues at the time had dissuaded him to postpone such an enterprise outside the capital until the Warsaw Clinic had broken the ice of ignorance, unquote. So you can see here is there's a real resistance prior to the war, and this is his attempt to shift things for the better. So more than 2 decades later, he makes another attempt, and this is how he does it through a medical ethics code. And this is what I believe was the central message of this document. By not mentioning abortion by name, yet by providing flexible language which permitted it on medical and social grounds, he wanted to appease his more moderate critics and thus initiate a gradual acceptance in the form of legalized abortion. Written against a background of powerful religious and atheist ideas in the form of Roman Catholicism and communist ideology, which produced considerable tensions and need for negotiation at the time in the healthcare system, the code reflected a carefully worded compromise that was aimed to facilitate and in the long run improve the reproductive choices and access to health of vulnerable groups. Now, let me just conclude to give you, as a case study, what we see here. Now, this is 50s. This is 20 years before actually, abortion is being legalized in some other parts of Europe, including Germany. So this is actually, when we look at it from a different perspective, it's actually quite advanced. So the findings highlight the extent to which we not only have to rethink the origins of bioethics in the 1970s, and I haven't, engaged with the issues of consent and all the other issues which were actually he was pushing forward, but move away from conceptualizing bioethics and its related discourses within an exclusively Western paradigm. By challenging the orthodox historiographical positions of scholars who, from their retrospective post-1989 vantage point, detected an, quote, inherently paternalistic system of medicine in Central Eastern Europe, I hope to have highlighted the extent to which leading medical ethicists and intellectuals in Central Eastern Europe engaged in debates and transnational exchanges about what we would today consider fundamental principles of modern bioethics, including the principle of respect for life, individual autonomy, and the freedom of medical decision-making. Responding to rapid post-war changes in medical science and technology and the dual challenge of Roman Catholicism and communist ideology, they felt compelled to revise traditional Hippocratic medical ethics through the codification of new medical ethics codes. They were basically saying, we don't need to sort of all constantly bring up Hippocrates anymore. It's become meaningless. We need to actually move away from that and actually put some meat to this matter. Their activities set in motion a broad public and professional conversation how best to rationalize medical ethics, to tackle the growing kaleidoscope of bioethical challenges. Rather than being dominated exclusively by a paternalistic medical paradigm, as some have argued, the Polish debate and the controversies ran in parallel to, and in some instances actually predated, the origins of Western bioethics movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And just to give you an example, when you look at the principle of informed consent here, this is 1967. This is very much in terms of the Nuremberg Code, the right of the patient to have a free informed consent. So it's been integrated into these documents from a very early on. It's reflected in the 59 document, and finally when it was published in 67. And I think it just highlights also, when we look further into at the international level of the Declaration of Helsinki, of which we have some experts here, we realize again the importance of integrating the issues of health-related research into those kind of documents. And continue to make sure that these are actually properly being reflected. Thank you very much.